This is the story of Tabi, the boy with a birthmark. In a very quiet and remote village, Zuma, lived Tabi, a boy marked by both fate and distinctive birthmark on his chest and arm. Tabi was the son of Mr. Gabi, a hard-working man who lost his wife when Tabi was just a toddler. Trying to rebuild his family, Mr. Gabi married Abike, a woman who was supposed to care for Tabi as her own. However, Abike, who later had her own daughter named Gina, treated Tabi with cruelty. She saw him as a burden and mistreated him, all the while keeping her true feelings hidden from her husband. Mr. Gabi is usually not at home because of the nature of his job. He comes back very late at night and leaves for work as early as possible. His job sometimes takes him out of station. Tabi grew up believing that Abike was his mother. His life under Abike's roof was a painful journey, marked by cruelty and neglect that deepened with each passing year. From the moment Abike entered his life, she saw him as nothing more than a nuisance, a reminder of Mr. Gabi's first wife. While she showered her own daughter Gina with affection, Tabi became the target of her frustration and bitterness. As Tabi grew older, the small acts of cruelty turned into outright abuse. The house felt like a prison for him, each corner reminding him of the pain he endured daily. Abike would wake him before dawn, assigning him endless chores, sweeping, fetching water, cooking for the family, and so on, while Gina slept on or played freely. Every day, he would be too tired to focus on schoolwork. But when he tried to explain to Abike, she would snare, "Lazy boy, you are just looking for excuses to avoid work." But it wasn't just the chores that wore him down. It was the starvation that came with it. Most nights, Tabi went to bed on an empty stomach, while Abike fed Gina lavish meals. On rare occasions, when she gave him food, it was often the leftovers, cold and unappetizing food. "This is all you deserve," she would say, tossing the scraps towards him as if he were an animal. Tabi was too afraid to complain, but his body, frail and weak from constant hunger, he was starting to show the signs of malnutrition. Whenever Mr. Gabi was home, Abike wore a mask of kindness. She would smile sweetly, pretending to care for Tabi. But as soon as Mr. Gabi was out of sight, the mask would slip. Tabi once mustered the courage to tell his father about his constant hunger. "Mother never gives me food," he said quietly, his voice trembling. Mr. Gabi, concerned, confronted Abike, but she was quick with her lies. "Tabi eats too much," she snapped. "He is always hungry because he is gluttonous, not because I don't feed him." Mr. Gabi believed her, and Tabi's hope of finding protection in his father was shattered. The beatings soon became a routine. Abike took every opportunity to unleash her anger on him. One day, while playing with Gina, Tabi accidentally pulled a toy too hard and it broke. Gina wailed, calling for her mother. Abike stormed in, her face twisted with rage. Without waiting for an explanation, she grabbed a belt and whipped Tabi across the back. "You useless boy," she screamed. "You destroy everything you touch." She threw him into the kitchen, demanding he fetch water and scrubs the floors. Hungry, tired, and overwhelmed, Tabi accidentally spilled some water on the floor. Furious, Abike picked up a broom and began beating him relentlessly. Tabi shielded himself, but the blows kept coming. "You worthless boy, you are nothing," she shouted at each stroke. Blood trickled from a cut on his cheek where the broom handle had struck him. Tabi tried to hold back his tears, but he couldn't. He felt trapped, suffocating in a house that was supposed to be his home, but had turned into a nightmare. The final straw that broke the camel's back was on a certain period when Mr. Gabi traveled for an out-of-station job. Abike stopped Tabi from going to school and insisted he stayed at home to do chores. For hours, he was busy with the chores. Coming back home drenched in sweat and exhausted from fetching firewood, hoping for a little water and rest, but as soon as he stepped into the house, Abike was waiting for him. "Where have you been? Slacking off again?" She threw him into the kitchen to continue with house chores. While he was washing the dishes in the kitchen, his hands trembling and accidentally let a plate slip from his grasp. The loud crash brought Abike running. "You stupid child," she shouted and spat on him. This time she slapped him so hard that his vision blurred. Then, as punishment, she locked him in the storage room and refused to give him food for 2 days. The tiny dark room became his prison, with no window and barely any air. When she finally let him out, Tabi was weak and dizzy, his legs barely able to hold him up. That evening, as his body ached and hunger gnawed at his stomach, Tabi made a decision. He couldn't live like this anymore. As soon as the house was quiet, he crept out, leaving behind the only home he had ever known, but also the torment that had riddled his young life. With nowhere to go, Tabi wandered aimlessly down the road and sneaked into a delivery van that was parked by the roadside. Due to how weak he was, he slept off and didn't know when the driver came back to the van and drove off. The driver drove from Zuma to Kake City, unbeknown to the driver that a little boy was sleeping in his van. Along the way, Tabi woke up but couldn't make any noise because he was afraid of what the driver would do to him if he found him in his vehicle. Eventually, when the driver stopped at Kaki, Tabi sneaked out of the van and realized he was in an entirely new city. He couldn't recognize any landmarks. Everywhere was dark, as it was still early hours of the morning. In his confused and disoriented state of mind, he wandered aimlessly into the road, and his steps were slow and tired. As he crossed a dimly lit street, too weak to notice the speeding vehicle approaching, a loud screech pierced the air. The next thing Tabi felt was a sudden, sharp impact that threw him to the ground. The world went dark, Tabi was knocked down by a hit-and-run driver. Tabi was left lying on the side of the road. Most people assumed he was dead, and no one knew who he was to report the accident to his family. He has become just another forgotten child, a victim of abuse and neglect. Fortunately, a kind-hearted woman named Mrs. Jack saw the boy and rushed him to the hospital. Tabi survived, but the trauma from the accident caused him to lose his memory, including the knowledge of his family. Meanwhile, Mr. Gabi returned home and learned that Tabi was missing. Abike told him that Tabi was very stubborn and had run away after she disciplined him. Mr. Gabi searched for his son, reporting his disappearance to the police, but after months of fruitless searching, he mourned Tabi as if he were dead. Years passed. Mrs. Jacks, who had informed the police about Tabi, decided to adopt him legally, as no one came forward to claim the boy. She and her husband, a businessman, raised Tabi alongside their daughter Ola in the city of Kaki, where they lived. The boy, who once knew hardship, had now been given a chance at a new life. Tabi thrived in his new environment, growing into a tall, handsome, and intelligent young man. He was particularly close to Ola, whom he treated as a beloved younger sister, always protecting her at school. Tabi excelled academically and eventually studied medicine and surgery at the university. He graduated as a medical doctor and soon became a renowned surgeon in the city. Mr. and Mrs. Jacks were proud of the man Tabi had become. Tabi has become one of the best surgeons in town. One day, a patient was brought into the hospital where Tabi worked. He was the surgeon assigned to operate on Mr. Gabi. During the heart surgery, Tabi noticed something unusual. The man had the same birthmark on his chest as Tabi had. He was stunned, but completed the surgery professionally. After the surgery, curiosity gnawed at him. He had long known from his foster parents that he had been found as a lost child after an accident. Could this patient be connected to his past? After the patient's recovery, Tabi engaged the man, Mr. Gabi, in a conversation. He noticed that Mr. Gabi had no idea who he was speaking to. Tabi felt compelled to share his story, and he mentioned that he too had a birthmark identical to the one on Mr. Gabi's chest. When Mr. Gabi saw Tabi's birthmark and the one on his arm, a flood of emotion overwhelmed him. He began to piece together the truth. Could this doctor be the son he thought had died years ago? The more they talked, the more flashes of his childhood memory flooded back to Tabi. And all of a sudden, he realized that the patient sitting before him was his biological father. Mr. Gabi exclaimed, "You are indeed my lost son. I am sorry for not believing and protecting you enough." And they hugged each other and started crying. Mrs. Jacks was called in to explain how she had found Tabi years ago after he was knocked down by a car. She recounted how the injury had caused Tabi to lose his memory, preventing him from remembering his true identity. Mr. Gabi was overwhelmed with gratitude for Mr. and Mrs. Jacks, who had cared for and raised Tabi as their own. Abike had also been sick and confined on a wheelchair. Hearing the story was filled with shame. She realized that her husband's biological son, whom she had mistreated and neglected as a little child, was the very man who had saved her husband's life in the hospital. She could hardly face him. Despite the lost years, Tabi was overjoyed to be reunited with his biological father. He remained deeply grateful to his foster family, who had given him love and opportunities he could never have imagined. His bond with Ola deepened over time, and eventually Tabi and Ola fell in love and got married. Tabi's story became one of resilience, love, and the mysterious ways in which life brings people back to where they belong. Through it all, he never forgot the kindness of Mr. and Mrs. Jacks, the love of his father, and the importance of family. Together, they all lived happily, healing old wounds and embracing a brighter future.